My brother mocked me at the Christmas party. You're just homeless. But only 30 minutes later, he learned exactly why you never humiliate someone who's been quiet for too long. Before we dive into the story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I'm always curious to see how far these stories reach. Now let's get into it. I stood at the doorway of my brother Calder's mansion, snow melting on my coat, boots still damp from the bus ride. Around me, warm lights spilled from chandeliers the size of my old studio apartment. Laughter, champagne, and Christmas jazz filled the air as though perfection lived at this address. Calder, tall, polished, smiling a little too wide, walked toward me like a host greeting a stranger rather than his sister. He looked immaculate, decked out in a velvet green tux and the smug confidence of someone who believed life bent for him alone. Before I'd even made it 5 steps inside, he announced loud enough for the entire room to hear, "Everyone, look who finally made it. Our little wanderer, fresh off the streets, I assume." Conversations stopped. Guests stared. Some with pity, some with confusion, and some with the shameful thrill people feel when witnessing humiliation that isn't theirs. I swallowed my breath so hard it hurt. He wasn't finished. I mean, should we set up a donation box? Maybe a sleeping bag under the tree for her? Isn't that what drifters need? A few chuckles floated up like cheap bubbles. My mother looked stunned, but she pretended not to hear, too afraid to disrupt the image she coexisted under. But Aunt Velma, sitting silently near the fireplace, locked eyes with me. He knew. She remembered everything. Because the truth was, I wasn't homeless because life fell apart. I was homeless because Calder secretly drained the trust fund our late father assigned to me, forged signatures, and pinned the financial collapse on my irresponsibility. I lived through months of disgrace because no one suspected the golden child. No one except Aunt Velma, and my father, who left one final failsafe. Which is why the small envelope inside my coat pocket felt heavier than my past. It contained documents, timestamps, forged authorizations, and my father's handwritten note found in his old records. Calder thought I showed up desperate and broken, shaking in borrowed boots with nowhere to land. He didn't know I walked through his door with everything required to take down his entire kingdom. 30 minutes. That's all it would take. I always understood numbers better than people, and my dad, Jonas Maddox, saw that long before anyone else did. He used to say I had a mind that refused to sleep until the last digit made sense. We spent quiet evenings reviewing financial statements together while everyone else focused on appearances, reputation, and social influence. Before he went to the hospital for the last time, he handed me sealed documents and simply said, "You'll know when to open these." I didn't understand the weight of that moment until everything in my life collapsed. After he passed, Calder slid into the role of family authority like he'd been rehearsing it for years. He talked softly, moved confidently, and built an image that made him look responsible, successful, and trustworthy. People followed him without question, including our mother, Patrice. She relied on comfort, not truth, and Calder fed her exactly what she needed to avoid confrontation. He convinced her I wasn't reliable, that I lacked discipline, and that I shouldn't be trusted with anything involving responsibility. She didn't fight him, she simply accepted his version of me. While I was packing my belongings after my life fell apart, I opened an old storage box looking for winter clothes and found the documents Dad gave me. I also found handwritten notes, his notes, side by side with numbers that didn't match what I remembered seeing months earlier. The transactions didn't align, the movement of funds was off, and my signature appeared on forms I never touched. I stared at those pages for hours, thinking maybe exhaustion was twisting my perception. But the more I checked, the clearer it became. Money had been diverted without authorization, and every path pointed directly to Calder. I spent weeks confirming what I suspected. I cross-referenced statements, contacted legal professionals cautiously, and avoided anyone connected to the family. I didn't vent, didn't ask for emotional support, didn't warn Calder, and didn't confront Patrice. I stayed silent, working late nights in cold rooms, building a timeline so detailed there would be no space for denial. Every answer I needed came from facts, not speeches. During all of this, no one reached out to ask if I was safe, struggling, or even eating. Calder controlled the narrative so tightly that he made it sound like I needed space to get my head right. Fine. Let them believe whatever made them comfortable. Tonight is the first time I've stood in front of him since everything was taken from me. I'm not here for sympathy, attention, or validation. I'm here because truth has perfect timing, and tonight it finally arrived with me. The party was everything Calder loved. Flawless lighting, curated music, staged laughter, and guests dressed as if they were auditioning for approval. I could smell roasted rosemary lamb, imported desserts, and wine chosen more for its label than its taste. Every detail screamed wealth, but it felt colder than the snow outside. I tried to move quietly, staying near the edges of conversations, unnoticed and unbothered. Calder, however, never allowed anything he considered imperfect to blend into the background. He approached me near the fireplace with a smile designed for an audience, not a sibling. Without lowering his voice, he commented on how I must be getting used to couches and borrowed spaces by now, making sure every nearby guest heard. He continued with a sarcastic tone, asking if I carried everything I owned in my pockets, and if I needed a spare suitcase from the charity bins he kept in the garage. His fake concern sliced sharper than shouting ever could. I saw guests glance at me with uncertain eyes, unsure whether to laugh or pretend they didn't hear. A few nervous chuckles slipped out, people who didn't want to be the ones he targeted next. No one asked if his words were true, and no one asked if I was all right. Silence became its own betrayal, confirming just how powerful image was in that room. Patrice stood nearby, hands clasped tightly, gaze fixed on the floor. She whispered nothing, didn't touch my arm, didn't redirect the moment. Her silence was permission for Calder to continue. I felt heat from the fire on my skin, but inside I was ice. I refused to argue, defend myself, or reveal a single piece of what I carried. My lack of reaction made his smile falter for a second, as if he wondered why the easy target didn't flinch. He expected tears, outrage, or a dramatic exit. I gave him none. I simply looked at him, steady and quiet, until he ran out of clever lines. When he finally stepped away, satisfied with his performance, I walked outside into the cold night air. Snow fell softly, coating everything in silence. My breath formed steady clouds, not shaky ones. I wasn't out there to recover. I was out there to time my next move. Tonight wasn't about surviving humiliation. It was about letting him believe he'd already won. I stood under the porch light, steadying my breath, when I heard the slow shuffle of familiar footsteps. Aunt Velma wrapped her shawl tighter and joined me without asking a single question. She didn't offer pity, comfort, or disbelief. She simply waited for me to speak, and that silence felt like support. When I finally whispered that I was done letting lies decide my place, she nodded as though she had been waiting for that declaration. With a soft voice, she reminded me of something my father once shared privately. If betrayal ever surfaced within the family, truth would eventually find the one capable of carrying it. Her eyes held a meaning I couldn't quite grasp until she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small locket, old and weighty, clearly untouched for years. She said my father entrusted it to her with instructions that it should go only to the person who chose truth over peace. My fingers opened it slowly, and inside was a tiny folded strip of paper with numbers written in my father's handwriting. My pulse quickened, not from surprise but from confirmation. I recognized the pattern instantly. It aligned with the set of documents already tucked into my coat. A code. A key. A direct link to a private safe Calder never mentioned to anyone, and certainly never expected me to access. I felt everything click together. Not someday, not when circumstances improved, not when legal procedures dragged for months, but now. Calder wasn't protected by time anymore. He was surrounded by evidence, and he didn't even realize it was closing in on him tonight in his own home, while his guests toasted to his fabricated legacy. Aunt Velma placed a steady hand on my shoulder, not to hold me back but to anchor the moment. I closed the locket, placed it securely in my palm, and straightened my coat. This wasn't impulsive revenge. This was execution of truth. I wasn't walking back inside as the quiet sister. I was stepping in with the final piece my father left behind, ready to use it with calm precision. I squared my shoulders, inhaled deeply, and turned toward the door. My resolve was no longer forming. It was finished. I walked back inside as if nothing had happened, brushing snow from my sleeves and slipping into the flow of conversation. I didn't avoid Calder. I placed myself close enough to hear every word he shared with his guests. He stood near the piano with a drink in his hand, gesturing confidently while retelling his favorite narratives about leadership, responsibility, and how he personally guided the family finances with unmatched discipline. The more he talked, the clearer it became that he relied on rehearsed lines, not truth. I listened without interrupting, memorizing every contradiction that slipped through his polished tone. Each time our eyes met, his expression shifted just slightly, confusion mixed with irritation. He expected me to look small, defensive, or embarrassed. Instead, I met his gaze with steady calm, giving him nothing to feed on. My quiet observation unsettled him more than any argument could. He adjusted his cufflinks twice, straightened his tie needlessly, and swallowed his drink faster than before. The man who controlled every room suddenly didn't know how to control mine. Patrice approached me, fingers trembling against my arm, whispering for me to stay gentle and not create unnecessary conflict. Her voice carried fear rather than guidance, as if a single ripple might destroy the fragile world she depended on. She glanced at Calder as if she needed permission to continue. For the first time, I saw how deeply she relied on his version of reality to feel safe. She begged me to ignore the earlier comments and let the evening stay pleasant. But I stepped away slowly and faced her. I told her quietly, without anger or tears, "I'm done being quiet." I watched her eyes widen, not because she understood, but because she sensed something irreversible had begun. She searched my face the way someone looks for flames before smelling smoke. I stayed near Calder again, not to threaten him, but to watch his performance crumble under its own weight. The more I observed, the more his charisma cracked. He stumbled through facts he should have known clearly, changed details mid-sentence, and exaggerated achievements he once stated modestly. Guests exchanged uncertain glances, sensing an invisible shift without understanding its source. I didn't need to raise my voice or ask a single question. My presence alone became a countdown he couldn't hear but somehow felt. The room was still celebrating, glasses clinking and music floating, but beneath it all, tension pressed harder with every passing second. Everything was ready. The moment only needed timing. I waited until he gathered everyone around for what he called a year-end gratitude moment, standing near the staircase like a polished host prepared to deliver something inspirational. When he raised his glass, I stepped forward, not aggressively, but with the composure of someone who already knew how the night would end. My voice cut through the noise before he could begin again. I said I wanted to share something important regarding the family's financial affairs. The room softened into curiosity rather than suspicion because no one expected anything meaningful from me, especially not there, not then. He tried to laugh it off, speaking over me, but I continued without raising my voice. I reached into my coat and unfolded organized documents, pages marked with dates, withdrawals, signatures, and account movements. I stated that an extensive discrepancy existed and that the information required full transparency. I didn't accuse, dramatize, or raise emotion. I simply laid out facts with the same precision I used when Dad first trusted me with numbers. Guests leaned in, expressions tightening as they recognized the authenticity of what I held. Calder lunged forward, reaching to grab the papers, masking panic behind an irritated smirk. I stepped back before he touched anything, leaving him momentarily suspended between anger and fear. Gasps rippled through the crowd, not because he reached but because I didn't even flinch. I handed the top document to the nearest guest rather than let it stay in my hands, ensuring eyes other than mine would see it. Whispered reactions traveled quickly as the pages moved along the semicircle of well-dressed observers. Aunt Velma stepped beside me, addressing the room with steady confidence. She stated that Jonas left a safeguard known only to those he trusted, and confirmed the existence of additional access instructions encoded in the locket. Her voice, calm and unwavering, shifted the energy from disbelief to realization. There was no dramatic reveal, only a quiet acknowledgement that truth had been waiting for the right moment to surface. Marla's reaction was subtle but devastating. Her face drained of color, fingers covering her mouth as though she recognized something she once brushed aside. She didn't ask questions. Her silence indicated previous suspicion she never voiced, perhaps because believing the truth would have destroyed her marriage long before tonight. No one moved. No one pretended it was a misunderstanding. The music kept playing faintly in the background, deeply out of place, as though even the speakers didn't know whether to continue or stop. Every cheerful decoration suddenly looked staged. Conversations dissolved into an unspoken awareness. Everything they thought they understood about this family had shifted in a single controlled moment. Calder's confident posture collapsed almost instantly. His voice rose in uneven bursts as he tried redirecting the situation, insisting that any unusual activity came from misplaced files, outdated records, or errors created before he gained full oversight. When no one reacted with agreement, he shifted direction and accused me of misunderstanding the documents, claiming my emotions distorted judgment. His eyes flashed toward Patrice, urging her to back him up, but she stood frozen, torn between loyalty and dawning realization. When that didn't work, he attempted to drag the conversation toward our father, insinuating that Jonas left everything in a disorganized state that forced him to take drastic measures. Each excuse contradicted the previous one, unraveling faster than he could rebuild it. I didn't argue with his outbursts. Instead, I presented clear sequences of dates, amounts, account numbers, and correspondences that eliminated speculation. I listed transactions aligned with his personal purchases and private ventures, including property acquisitions under shell entities he never disclosed. Every number matched precisely, leaving no space for improvisation. The more straightforward I remained, the more desperate he became. His voice cracked into frantic denial, not for innocence but for control slipping through his grasp. Marla stepped forward, trembling, asking him directly about a statement she once found hidden among unrelated paperwork. She had believed his explanation when he told her it belonged to an abandoned investment plan. Her voice broke as she admitted she wanted to trust him, choosing comfort over suspicion. Her question wasn't loud, but the tone behind it carried a depth of betrayal that silenced the air more than shouting ever could. Calder refused to answer, unable to form a coherent response. His desperation turned physical as he tried moving toward me, reaching out as though he could force silence by proximity alone. Several guests intercepted him immediately, placing themselves between us without needing instruction. Their intervention wasn't aggressive. It was instinctive, driven by the unmistakable recognition that control had shifted permanently. His pleas turned into fragmented accusations, pointing at everyone except himself, his eyes wide with disbelief rather than strategy. While he struggled against the sudden barrier of bodies and truth, Velma quietly stepped aside to make a discreet call. She didn't raise her voice, didn't display outrage, and didn't look back at him. She simply relayed what needed to be communicated. Meanwhile, I stood still, not stepping back nor forward, allowing the weight of verified evidence to speak in my place. My expression didn't change, even as the final layer of his persona dissolved in front of those he tried so hard to impress. The quiet of the room shifted again when uniformed officers stepped through the doorway, their presence deliberate but unobtrusive. Calder's protests faded as he was guided into another room, each word cut short by professional firmness. Guests who had lingered nearby exchanged glances, murmuring softly to each other, voices tinged with regret and newfound understanding. A few approached me hesitantly, muttering apologies for believing in the narrative Calder had spun for so long. Their expressions were awkward, guilty, and uncertain, but sincerity shone through the hesitation. Patrice appeared suddenly at my side, her face streaked with tears. She reached for my hands, trembling voice breaking as she confessed how blind she had been, how she had allowed fear and reliance on Calder to silence her instincts. I didn't pull away, didn't speak in anger. I let her release what had been pent up for years. Her confession was heavy, but it felt lighter than the tension in the room had been moments ago. I responded with simple, measured words. I didn't elaborate, lecture, or lash out. I summarized what had happened, recounting facts, dates, and discrepancies in neutral tones, letting clarity replace judgment. It wasn't victory I sought, just recognition of what had been concealed and finally revealed. From the window, snow drifted lazily onto the manicured lawn, coating the grounds in a calm white hush. Officers led Calder through the foyer, handcuffed, restrained, and finally quieted. His expression flitted between disbelief and humiliation. A mirror of the chaos he had orchestrated for years now reflected back at him in silence and consequence. I exhaled slowly, letting the chill from outside mix with the release of tension I hadn't realized I had been holding. The house hummed quietly around me, a stark contrast to the storm that had just been contained. I felt the weight lift from my shoulders, not because the night was perfect but because truth had finally cleared the air. I stood still for a moment, letting the snowfall and the subdued whispers remind me that this chapter had ended. For the first time in months I breathed freely. The next morning, I met with the estate attorney in a small office downtown, the morning light slicing through blinds and landing across piles of organized files. I didn't feel triumph or relief yet, only the quiet determination of someone ready to reclaim what had been taken. Every form signed, every procedure initiated, felt like reconstructing a life that had been dismantled without my consent. I listened carefully as the attorney outlined the steps to restore my rightful portion of the family trust, correcting misappropriations and clearing my name from false accusations. When I returned home later, Patrice appeared at the door, hesitant, offering her guest room. Her voice trembled, sincere but cautious, as though fearing my refusal would break her. I smiled gently, thanked her, and declined. I wanted a fresh start in a place of my own, not a temporary reprieve surrounded by old memories of dependence and fear. This was about autonomy, not revenge, and I refused anything that resembled the past I was leaving behind. Velma joined me soon after, carrying a small, worn box. Inside lay my father's watch, its leather strap cracked, the face slightly scratched but still gleaming with quiet dignity. She handed it to me carefully, her voice soft but firm. "Your father always knew you'd be the strong one." I held it in my palm, feeling the weight of his trust and foresight. It wasn't just a gift. It was a symbol, a reminder that resilience and clarity had always been part of who I was. By evening, I began unpacking boxes in my new apartment, arranging books, photographs, and small mementos with care. Each object I placed felt like a brick in the foundation of a life I could finally claim for myself. I called no one, needed no validation, and let the silence fill the space with purpose rather than emptiness. I had lost much, but tonight, for the first time in years, I was building something purely my own. Every small action, folding clothes, placing documents, adjusting the lamp, felt like reclaiming not just assets but my dignity, my autonomy, and my peace. I was finally free to move forward. Weeks later, Calder's name appeared in court filings, and legal notices confirmed charges of embezzlement and fraud. I didn't watch the trial closely. I didn't need to. The consequences were no longer abstract, and the law was finally moving with the certainty that human emotion often lacked. I let the process unfold while I focused on reclaiming what mattered to me beyond material proof. I moved into an apartment that wasn't large, but it was mine. The walls were a soft cream, the windows catching early sunlight in a way that felt deliberate. I arranged my desk near the window, and above it hung my father's watch carefully. Its weight reminded me of foresight, patience, and the quiet endurance he had always trusted me to hold. Every time I looked at it, I felt grounded, an anchor to both past lessons and present independence. Velma stopped by, and together we invited a few relatives who had quietly supported me through the uncertainty, those whose trust and belief had never wavered. We shared simple food, conversation that wasn't performative, and laughter that had no expectation of validation. It was a small gathering, but it felt monumental compared to the grandeur of Calder's parties. The warmth wasn't in decorations or labels. It was in recognition, loyalty, and honesty. I realized that family could be chosen, nurtured, and respected without compromising dignity. I reflected on the past months, on Calder's smirk, his words, and the audience he gathered to watch me fail. I didn't feel bitterness or desire for spectacle. Instead, I felt clarity. He had mocked me, assumed weakness where there was strategy, and underestimated the quiet persistence that patience can cultivate. He never realized that the small, deliberate steps I had taken were enough to dismantle his control, expose his lies, and reclaim my rightful place. The match had been in my hands all along, and I had lit it without a flame of anger, just the careful application of truth, timing, and resolve. I sipped my tea, glancing at the watch, and finally allowed myself a deep, steady breath, knowing I had everything I needed to move forward, unshaken, independent, and unbound. Do you think I did the right thing by standing up to my family and reclaiming what was mine, or should I have tried to forgive and give them another chance? I'm really curious to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you want more stories like this, subscribe and hit the notification bell.